Well, I started with the repertoire with just the cello part by myself and listening to the recordings, and then we got into the first couple of rehearsals, and I feel this way with every single piece that I've ever worked on. It always feels like absolute chaos at first. The beauty of the rehearsal process is eventually it starts to become more orderly, and I start to understand all of the intricacies of this music, which is just absolutely beautiful. And a real hallmark of excellent music, which this is that it just keeps getting better and better the more I know it.
Well, so when we first kind of dove into this piece, it's a sort of familiar tonal language, but definitely some twists in there. It's kind of exciting. This is a piece that I'd never heard before, and I don't think my colleagues had heard this piece either. So it's sort of the closest we're ever going to get to being Indiana Jones, sort of discovering these new works. So it was really fun to dive in and just kind of discover what this piece was about.
Really unknown music, and it's been, of course, the first encounter of the Mexican chamber music for me. The first thing that really struck me is how beautiful and how rich that language is. It reminds me a lot about the language of Rachmaninoff, which is very dense. But yet extremely lyrical, and it's been quite a surprise. I would imagine that music, particularly by Manuel Ponce, would be more infused by his native Mexican influences, but it's actually much more universal, I would say more European. So that was surprising, but also really rewarding.
Both composers, I think, were monster pianists. I've heard some actually bad recording quality of a recording of Ponce playing his Concerto Romántico in Mexico City, and just amazing virtuosity.
I'm going to talk about the Ponce in particular. The music reminds me of a lot of different composers' music, but it feels like its own composition in itself and its own particular style. I understand he wrote it in his early 20s when he was living in Germany at the time, and was very much so under the influence of German masters, and so you can really hear the music of Brahms and Rachmaninoff as we've been studying and getting to know it, but it feels like its own voice, and it's this beautiful, lush, romantic music with melodies that go on for eons.
They're a tremendous amount of fun to play. I would say in some ways the Ponce requires a little more concentration with the strings because the pianist is not as busy. So there's a little bit more responsibility there as a chamber musician and collaborator. And the Rolón reminds me of some other big European chamber music that I've played, where the pianist, it feels basically like you're playing a piano concerto. You're the head front of the stage, and the orchestra's just accompanying you. But I certainly don't want to give any slight to the string parts because they're fantastic as well.
So I'm going to talk about the Rolón piano quartet. The first movement is an allegro. It opens with this gorgeous soaring cello line, which I know our cellist is thrilled about, and he sounds wonderful on. At some point I get to join him, and that's a pretty great moment in that. The second movement is sort of this beautiful kind of cantilena style. Viola gets a solo in there. And then our third movement is sort of this really cute but excited scherzo. And then it ends with a fourth movement, also in 6/8, that sort of reminds us of carousel music, and then it sort of keeps going and then goes even bigger crescendi, and then finally kind of topples over into the end.
Piano trio is one of the standard chamber music repertoires. It's been explored by composers, particularly in the Romantic era.
I would definitely say this is very similar to Brahms and Rachmaninoff's writing. Very dense, triadic harmony with lots of tonal movement. It's extremely expressive in romantic music. It's a little bit to unpack at first, but just as I've listened to it lots, it's incredibly beautiful music.
So he definitely uses a romantic harmonic language. However, it's definitely got a little bit of some twists and turns in there that kind of makes it his own, which is very common for the time period. I hear some Schumann in this. I feel like it reminds me a little bit of Schumann chamber music.
Well, they're both phenomenal works. I would say that they are much more in line with European chamber music than they are representative of traditional Latin American music. Some of the programs that I've played works of Ponce are clearly influenced by a Mexican song, what they call the Mexican canción. And the trio by Ponce has, as Omar has actually mentioned, it has some of these Latin elements, but they're much more subtle than you would find in some of his other works. Ponce wrote quite a bit of solo piano music, and a lot of it sounds very much like in the line of Latin American tunes that have been set to the piano.
So I have already talked about how this music reminds me a lot about Rachmaninoff and maybe Brahms on some level, and I think that really richly romantic, lyrical, almost sentimental, but in a good way, style is really sort of tied to the best European traditions of the late 19th century, I would say. So this music has probably more of harking back in a tradition rather than looking forward. It's not thoroughly modern, it's really deeply rooted in the wonderful romantic traditions of the late 19th century.